This is Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball discussion, hosted by Inside the Hall founder and editor, Alex Bozich. Since 2007, Inside the Hall has been trusted by IU fans across the globe to be the one-stop shop for IU basketball news, commentary, and analysis. Join us over at InsideTheHall.com. That's InsideTheHall.com.
Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. And Indiana has its 30th coach in program history, Mike Woodson. News broke on Sunday afternoon that he was going to be the choice for the position. Yesterday, he was formally announced in Bloomington. And so Ryan Corazza and I are here to talk everything Mike Woodson. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about Thad Matta being brought into the fold as well. And just the coaching search is finally over. Ryan, big picture, your thoughts. This is a loaded question. What are your thoughts on Mike Woodson as the new head men's basketball coach at Indiana University?
Well, a new day has certainly dawned, and I think that it's quite a different there's going to be a different regime in town, I think, for sure. I think the first thing that stuck out, and it was the first thing Mike Woodson said in his press conference yesterday, was essentially, paraphrasing that this Indiana basketball is about Bob Knight. It's always been about Bob Knight. And then you saw, later, not the morning of the press conference, but I think maybe later afternoon or mid-afternoon, the Indiana University basketball Twitter account released a statement from Bob Knight in which it said our program in it, and he called Mike Woodson, he'll be a great disciplinarian. So it's, I think this short of a couple of years ago, if you had said that the school itself was going to be releasing a statement from Bob Knight, no one would believe that, right? So I think what we're seeing with the Woodson hire, and what Scott Dolson said about it was, look, I was looking for someone with these kind of specific qualities, or this look at the game, or this type of character. But having it be an ex-player was like the bonus or the cherry on top. And really, if you think about Scott Dolson, who, obviously he talked to a lot of people, but didn't do a search firm, kind of, as he said, got in the basement and was making phone calls a lot for this coaching search. He was a former IU basketball manager under Bob Knight in the kind of mid to late 80s-ish. And I think he is, and as he said when he talked to Thad Matta and when he talked to Mike Woodson, that there was just this bond they had, right? And they really hit it off. And I think that goes back to the tradition of Indiana basketball in, the 70s and 80s. And so there has always been talk about bringing that IU guy back and what that might mean. And, I can sit here right now and feel confident in saying that we have no idea what the results, win-losses are going to be. And I think that's ultimately most important for this hire with where things are at. But in terms of the IU family and trying to bridge the old and the new, I think this is being hit from the ground running right away with this hire.
Yeah, with Woodson specifically, I think the question that was brought up the most with people in the immediate aftermath of the hire was his lack of coaching in college. And I'll admit that I thought about that too a lot, but coaching hires are very much an imperfect science, and we've gone through, obviously Mike Davis inherited the job really from Bob Knight. It wasn't a formal coaching search, but Kelvin Sampson was brought in. I would say out of the previous hires that Indiana made, in terms of a basketball coach, he was the best hire that they made. You can see now that he's got Houston in the Final Four. It was off the court stuff and things behind the scenes that really were Kelvin Sampson's undoing. But with Tom Crean and Archie Miller, maybe Tom Crean to a less extent because he was at Marquette and it was a comparable level. But you've seen, the usual method is try to go get a guy from the mid-major or a little bit lower level and bring them up to IU and see kind of how it works out. And with Archie Miller, everybody was, in the immediate aftermath of the hire, positive about it and thought that it was going to work out. And I too, I looked at what he had done at Dayton and I was confident that he was going to at least be somewhat successful in Indiana. It didn't work out. And so the whole thing, all the discussion about Woodson not having much college experience, the more I've thought about it, I'm not as concerned about it because it's not like you're bringing in somebody that's never been a head coach and he's been in that seat. It's just been at a different level and arguably at a level that's more difficult to have success, the NBA. The NBA coaches are recycled very quickly. And the fact that he had 2 separate stints as a head coach, Atlanta and New York, and after his last New York stint, he's worked as an assistant in Los Angeles and I think the Knicks as well. He won a title as an assistant coach, I think under Larry Brown in Detroit. So I don't think you stick around in the NBA for as long as he has, whether it be as a head coach or an assistant coach, if you're not well respected and you don't have a knowledge of the game. So I think he checks those 2 boxes. So from that standpoint, I'm more confident in the hire from a coaching perspective because I just don't think guys last as long as he did in the NBA if you don't know the game and you can't coach. The other parts that we'll get to, obviously, is the running of the program and recruiting and all that. But from a coaching perspective, Ryan, do you have any concerns about Mike Woodson not knowing the game or his ability from an X's and O's perspective? Because to me, I think he's going to be able to handle that aspect of it.
Oh, I agree with that. And again, I think kind of going back to what you said at the beginning here in terms of what doesn't have the college experience, but then when you dig into it a little bit more, and I've been doing some research the last couple of days, just saw this video of Carmelo Anthony on JJ Redick's podcast, and they're talking about this legendary out of timeout play, Sweet Georgia Brown that Mike Woodson has run at a couple stops, and like everyone knew about this inbound play. So I think, he's certainly well regarded for X's and O's. I think when he took over that Knicks team, and I think it was the 2013-2014 season, maybe that they were definitely a 3-heavy team. Steve Novak, I know he got he kind of got Steve Novak paid, which is another thing that was said in this JJ Redick clip that I watched in terms of just kind of letting it fly. And that goes to what I personally thought was some of the more interesting stuff that he talked about in the initial press conference, which was style of play, and definitely would bring some of, I guess, more of the modern NBA style down. I mean, he said the 3-ball has changed the game, right? And defensively, he talked about, a lot of switching and just having guys that can play multiple positions. And, I think there's a reason why that style of basketball is resonating at that level, because if you have multiple guys that can switch on defense and guard multiple people, it becomes that much harder to put someone in a mismatch. And I think obviously a 3 is worth more than 2. And there, going along with a 3 being worth more than 2, I mean, it's a layups and 3-point shooting league, right? Because 3's worth more than 2 and shots around the basket are more efficient than like a 15, 16 footer. So to me, that's just smart because, just kind of digging into the analytics, like that stuff just makes sense. But does he have the personnel to do that? Like when I look at Indiana's roster, I'm not sure that they currently have a roster where they can switch a bunch on defense and it'll be okay. And I do, and who knows with what's going to happen with this transfer portal with the 6 that are in right now. But if everyone does come back, we've seen how this team has shot from the 3-point line the last 4 years. I think there are capable shooters. So again, it sort of remains to be seen how it would actually play out. But I think how he talked about it could be encouraging if it actually works out. I also just looking up, and I think that what's been said of his role with the Knicks this season was more on the offensive end. And is that correct? Correct me if I'm wrong on that. I don't know.
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. And I looked up the Knicks are. And they got a lot of young guys on that team. And Julius Randle has sort of ascended into this all-star status this year, and they're riding him a bit as well. But anyways, they're 10th in three-point shooting. There's a ton of NBA teams kind of shooting around 37%. But I did see too, and this might be a product of Tom Thibodeau, but I believe the Knicks are last in pace, so they're playing the slowest pace in the NBA. And that was one thing he didn't say. There's always those clips going around of the new coach being like, we're going to play fast. We're going to get up and down. We're going to play with pace. And he did not say that yesterday. And so it was kind of interesting just looking at the Knicks stats a bit and seeing that they don't play at sort of a run and gun style pace.
But he did say that he did mention a couple of things, that one of which you mentioned, the other I don't think you mentioned. He mentioned the switching on defense, which I think is a welcome phrase for IU fans after what they've watched with the pack line over the last 4 years, and kind of this stubborn philosophy to not adapt no matter how things are going. I think that's a welcome change. And then he also mentioned 1 in, 4 out offensively, which with what Archie Miller tried to do offensively, everything being clogged up so much and a lot of long twos being taken, I think that's certainly something that is going to has the potential to produce basketball that's more friendly on the eyes to watch. The other thing, I thought he hit on a lot, the shooting aspect of it. Talking about needing to bring in more shooting. That was something that really hurt Indiana over the last 4 years. And I think with the transfer portal, he's going to have the opportunity to maybe go out and get a guy or two that can make threes. You think about this roster over the last couple of years, if there was a James Blackman or a Nick Zeisloft type shooter out there that would have been on the team, I think it would have changed a lot, especially in close games where Indiana just couldn't seem to find the bucket from the perimeter at all.
Hey, it's Jared. I'm going to hop in here real quick and talk for a minute about HomefieldApparel.com, our friends at HomefieldApparel.com, where they have the best selection of vintage IU gear that you will find anywhere. And it's not just for IU. They have over 90, I don't know, it might be over 100 by now, different colleges and universities where they basically go back in time, pick out these old brand marks and logos that haven't been used in a long time, pull them back, and put them on the most comfortable t-shirts and crew necks and hoodies that you will find anywhere, and they sell them all for a good price. And they're comfortable, and they hold up to being being put in the washing machine. It's high-quality material. It's incredible logos. And look, it's a brand that you can support. They're Hoosiers. The guys behind Home Field Apparel went to IU. They cheer for IU. If you follow them on Twitter, you know that they've turned other fans of other schools into IU fans because of their presence there. So it's a great brand worth supporting. And the best part is when you support Home Field Apparel, you get awesome gear out of it, whether it's football designs, basketball designs. They've got something for everybody at HomefieldApparel.com, especially for the IU fans in your life or for you. So go to HomefieldApparel.com, use the promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, at checkout, and you will get 20% off your entire order. That's promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, at HomefieldApparel.com. Now back to the show.
Now, one thing that I was really encouraged by, I had some conversations yesterday with some folks kind of close to the situation, a couple players and things like that. But one thing that I was really encouraged by that it seems like Woodson's putting a heavy emphasis on as he talks to the team. He talked about this a lot in the press conference, but he's also talking to the guys that he wants to come back, is the player development aspect of it. And I think that is a crucial part of what needs to happen, because Indiana basketball has brought in over the last 3 or 4 recruiting cycles some very talented players that were ranked top 75, top 100 of the country, and I'm not sure that all of them, from a development standpoint, have been maximized in terms of their talent. So bringing somebody from the NBA who has worked with a lot of guys over a long period of time and has seen what works and what doesn't, I think can be beneficial. Now, what's is going to be important to see kind of how he structures all that, because there are limitations in college, how much you can work with guys. There's an hour limit each week, but if you get the right staff around and you have a plan for every player, that was one thing that, talking to somebody yesterday, that it never really seemed clear to the players over the past couple of years when they went into the gym and worked on things, what they needed to get better at. And I think Mike Woodson, one of the big things for him as a coach that's encouraging to me that he's already emphasizing is a plan for each player in terms of what needs to be emphasized when they're putting in extra work and what they need to get better at. And I think that should be a pretty good foundation for player development. Now, we'll have to see what he can do in terms of actually executing on this plan. But the fact that it's already being talked about and emphasized this much is very encouraging to me.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, look, it's a thing too where you can have those plans, and sometimes guys just don't work out, right? Sometimes they just don't improve, they don't get better. But emphasizing it more, I think, is important. And I think just phrases, it's just a press conference, just what he's saying as we're talking about here. But things like if you're a shooter, you're just expected to shoot it, right? And sort of that more confident mentality of sort of letting it fly. I think part of what we sometimes saw under Archie Miller seemed to be this lack of confidence, or this timidness, or just sort of this general mental sort of like slog from this team. And you wonder if, as the offensive energy kind of maybe opens up a bit, if they're going to have better spacing and they're going to maybe more of a 1 and 4 out, things of this nature, that within having the player development, within having a little bit of a different offensive structure, within the coach having kind of a different, sort of cadence or different way of speaking about some of this and different way of instilling some of that in these players, that could also be beneficial. I did find it interesting too. You talked about 4, and I think at one point he was like, or 2 and 3 out, but he didn't go for the extreme, like 5 out, like we're playing like the Rockets or the Nets or anything like that, or even how some of the teams that Indiana encountered in the Big Ten this season, like a Northwestern or Nebraska. So it's not like this bleeding edge, cutting edge, kind of pushing the Daryl Morey, like pushing basketball to the outer limits, to the extreme, in terms of like the extreme spacing. All 5 can shoot threes. And then there's just so much space to actually like get in and be able to get to the rim. But still taking some of the NBA stuff, but not at a level of that it's like at the very cutting edge of what things are happening in the NBA.
Yeah, another thing I think is important, and like our audience at Inside the Hall is obviously IU basketball fans, Big Ten fans, college basketball fans. But I know you and I follow the NBA as well. Not as closely as we follow IU, but we pay attention. And I think you bring up an interesting point there in terms of the concepts. I don't think some people think, well, the NBA is totally different than college. It is, because obviously there's 350 some college teams and there's 30 NBA teams. The talent level, obviously a big disparity. How rosters are constructed. But the game at from an X's and O's perspective, a lot what you're seeing now, concept-wise in college basketball, is trickling down from the NBA. So this notion that somebody, just because they've only coached in the NBA and haven't coached in college, that they're going to be unprepared from kind of a schematic or an X's and O's standpoint, I think is a little bit of a bad argument, because, as Woodson pointed out yesterday in the press conference, much of what you're seeing now in college basketball originated in the NBA, and kind of that's where the game is moving. As we've seen, getting away a lot in the NBA now from the traditional big man, a lot more floor spacing, a lot more focus on analytics. I'll be interested to kind of see what Woodson's philosophy is in terms of analytics, and if that's something that he's very open to looking at, and lineup composition and all that. But in terms of just the X's and O's, I think a lot of what is being done in college basketball now is a direct result of what we've seen in the NBA over the past 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and again, there's so many different styles that are still, I think, within the college game. But there's definitely been a trickle down, and it'll be interesting. These last 2 years, and obviously the wins and losses have not been great for Nebraska. And Fred Hoiberg's tenure in the NBA was much different than Mike Woodson. He was under a management structure in Chicago that was not great, and he didn't have much talent. And he came back to the college ranks, and there hasn't been a lot of stability in that Nebraska program. He's kind of had a lot of guys come in and out, but I just feel like if he can, recruit guys, get a little bit more talent in there, and continue to run that system, I think Nebraska has a chance to be a really tough cover, because they have so much size all over at every position, and they play that 5-out style. And I mean, Indiana had their defensive struggles regardless at times this year, but I just looked at how that team is constructed and said, wow, if he can get this going a little bit more, I think Nebraska will be really, really hard to guard. And if they have length at every position, and if they can lock in on defense, they can be really good as well. So I look at Nebraska as, again, the road for Fred Hoiberg and Mike Woodson were certainly different, but there's still kind of some of those similarities by bringing down the NBA style. I just think that Hoiberg is really more committed to that 5-out style. While it doesn't sound like for right now, Woodson is, or that even there's really the personnel for him to do that.
Well, you could certainly argue that Hoiberg doesn't necessarily have the personnel to do it, but he's still kind of sticking to that plan.
True.
The other thing, we've talked a lot about this hire now in a positive light and things to be excited about. I want to get to some of the things that people have questions about and get your perspective on a few things. I think the most immediate question, and we have kind of an answer to it in some sense, but we don't have the full picture, is what's Mike Woodson's staff going to look like at Indiana? And we got an answer in terms of administratively the setup with Thad Matta coming in as the, I think, associate athletic director for men's basketball administration. With a contract the same length of Woodson's. I think it's a 6-year deal. He's going to be paid $400,000 a year. Having that from a support aspect, I think, is obviously making people feel a lot better about Woodson's lack of college experience, because you're bringing in a guy who had a long, very successful run in the Big Ten in Thad Matta, who knows the ins and outs of what it takes to build a winner in the Big Ten. He understands how to put together a non-conference schedule, which is something obviously Mike Woodson has never done. He understands how to put together a recruiting schedule, how you organize things, just from a day-to-day administrative perspective in a basketball program. He's done that over a long period of time. He did it at Butler. He did it at Xavier. He did it at Ohio State, obviously, most successfully. So I think that question was somewhat answered. But the other piece of this is, who is Woodson going to surround himself with in terms of the 3 countable assistant coaches? And those are important because those are the guys that can work with the players day-to-day basis in practice. Those are the guys that can go out and recruit. And I think that's the biggest question a lot of people have. How's Indiana going to get players? And so, Ryan, I'm curious, from your perspective, I think it's important that Indiana, as much as they want to collaborate with Woodson, in terms of bringing in a staff. I also think it's important that he is able to bring in guys that not only fit Indiana, but also guys that he is comfortable with and trusts and works with. I think the worst thing that could happen here is trying to kind of force a staff in here that doesn't necessarily fit. I think you can strike a balance between getting guys that he's comfortable with and maybe have a pre-existing relationship with, and also guys that can be successful in the other aspects that you need in assistant coaches.
Yeah, I think that with the way that things were talked about and the way that Scott Dolson and the Archie Miller was fired presser basically said, he did call it sort of like looking for that CEO, but I think on the back half of this, we're hearing a lot of talk about like this collaborative approach. And I think Mike Woodson, there's sort of this humility to him in the sense of like, I just want good basketball minds around me. And he's not looking to be, super authoritative or anything like that. I think with the Thad Matta thing, it's certainly very interesting and kind of cool actually. And, we'll see how long he actually does end up sticking around, even though he does have this contract that's the same length. And honestly, if he hasn't taken a coaching job in these 4 years now, and he's not really looking to be the head coach, I think this seems like a good fit for him, especially because again, he's sort of got that growing up very interested in Indiana basketball and things of this nature. So it seems like between the three of them right now, they're sort of, even though look, with college basketball, we know it starts and ends with the head coach. And so I don't think having Thad Matta in that position is going to necessarily help on the court for wins and losses, but it definitely is a very experienced voice that, with Mike Woodson being 63 years old and never having this kind of role and leading this type of program at this level, I think is important. In terms of the rest of the staff, there's, first there's talk that Kenya Hunter may stay potentially. And I think he's, from a recruiting aspect, that's good. And that's certainly something that I think Mike Woodson is going to need experienced recruiters around him, because that's something that's, frankly, I suppose it's a weakness of his. I think people are trying to equate NBA free agency to the recruiting and such, but it's still not something that in this specific vein he's had experience with. There was that Woj bomb yesterday that Woodson has talked with Larry Brown about being an on-campus only assistant and not doing any recruiting. So it's possible one of these three roles that he picks someone that doesn't do any recruiting. And, that's a very interesting name for several reasons. The first is he's the only coach ever that's won an NBA title, which he did with the Pistons when I believe Mike Woodson was on his staff. And then he won an NCAA title, I believe, in '88 with Kansas. So, he coached the Allen Iverson team. It's like he's another, he's coached the Olympics. Even after his SMU stint, I saw he went over to Italy in 2018. He got fired halfway through the season. So this guy has coached at all levels in internationally, Olympics, and obviously is known as, a very good coach, a great basketball mind. He's 80 years old. So that's one thing to consider with this. And, secondarily, it's just, they've had, Woj, I think, is impeccable in terms of the reporting, in terms of his reporting. So, I certainly believe that this is true. But he's not hired yet, and he may not be hired. But one thing to consider with this, and Dolson talked about this yesterday, whether, I can't remember if it was in this press conference or I heard him on JMV in the afternoon in an interview as well. But there's that. If we're doing this, these guys are doing this sort of bridging the gap from the old to the new, and Indiana basketball tradition doesn't change. And there's that talk about doing things the right way, right? Well, Larry Brown at all three of his stops pretty much got hit with sanctions. I think when he made the Final Four with UCLA, there was later on after that, two of the players were ineligible, so that got vacated. At Kansas, there was a a potential recruit. There was a recruit on campus that they like gave money to go see his ill grandmother, which that's very NCAA type violation. Like, that doesn't seem too bad, I guess, in the grand scheme of violations. But at SMU, if you go back, when he was there, I think his last season was 2016. Obviously, he built them up a bit, and they got back to the tournament for the first time in forever under him. But if you read into the details, there's like academic fraud, and there's a couple other things there that, as the head coach in his mid 70s, that there were other sanctions hit there, and they were banned from the postseason. I think the next season, some of these details may be a little bit off, but that basically gives you the summation of Larry Brown as a head coach in the NCAA. He's pretty much gotten flagged with something at 3 of those stops. Now, if Larry Brown is just an assistant coach, he's not running the program. If he's not going out and recruiting, that's how they might be able to circle the square. But I just find it interesting that one of the names that's being tossed out, even though obviously I'm sure him and Mike Woodson have a great relationship, he is someone that doesn't seem to fit into that we do things the right way. So if this does come to fruition, I'm interested to hear how they message this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that he's not going to be, if he's brought in, which I agree with you. If Woj tweets something, you can take it to the bank that it's at least a possibility and something that's being discussed. And I'd heard it yesterday from somebody else as well, that it was a name that was kind of being tossed around some of these conversations. I think the way I would look at it as, if he's not going to be an assistant coach, somebody that's recruiting or coaching, but just somebody that's around to bounce ideas off of in terms of being a basketball guy, I don't have a problem with it from that perspective whatsoever, because this is a guy who's coached some of the greatest players to ever play the game, and as you mentioned, his experience in terms of winning a lot of games at the NBA level and the college level is right up there with some of the best coaches to ever do it. So from that perspective, I don't think it's gonna. I don't think it'd be a situation where Larry Brown's going to be, if he's brought in, making decisions on what happens with the team and the roster and all that. But I just think I'm getting the sense that, like, just in terms of how this is all going to be put together, it's almost like they're trying to build a team that's attractive to really high-level players, and that they can say all these different resources are available to players to come and develop in Indiana. Because you look at, all right, Mike Woodson's worked in the NBA. He's worked with Carmelo Anthony. He's obviously coached a ton of NBA players, has great relationships. There's videos circulating right now on Twitter and social media of guys like Kenyon Martin, Jamal Crawford talking about how they love playing for him. You mentioned that clip with, I think, Carmelo Anthony and JJ Redick talking about him. I mean, so that you've got obviously him from the standpoint of, his players in the NBA loved him and respect him. You've got Thad Matta, who's done it all in the Big Ten, went to a national championship game, recruited Greg Oden, who went on to be the number 1 pick. And then you start talking about the assistant coaches, if they all have ties to the NBA in some way, or people that are going to be around. I think, and this is just from talking to a couple people yesterday that are, connected to current players, I very much feel like they're setting this up to be, very much a player development type program where you've got a lot of guys with different experience, and they're selling it as, we can get you where you want to go because we've been there. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because the players that you really want to get in college basketball, now we don't know how things are going to change with the G League and maybe some of the cream of the crop maybe leaving and going around the NCAA and not playing. But you want guys that want to get to the NBA. And I think if you can sell yourself as a program that has all these resources, that know the NBA and that know what it takes to get there, I don't necessarily look at that as a bad thing.
No, if it works, I think it's really smart. be for all those reasons you listed. And if we think about whatever the last 15 years or so of Indiana basketball, I think in Tom Crean's tenure, he understood that. I think he was very reticent to talk about the Indiana players in the NBA, right? The Dwayne Wade, the Final Four run. And those, because as you said, this is very important to, top level recruits, and having those relationships, I think is important for them to see and to know that you're sort of in the room in the NBA, so to speak. And Archie Miller, as far as I saw in the 4 years, didn't talk about it at all. I mean, he may have relationships in the NBA, not to sit here and say I know that to an expert level, but there was really never any talk about getting anybody to the next level or anything like that at all. And Archie Miller just seemed to be cut from like the just college, almost college and college only in terms of how he operated, and not sort of seeing that through line and that connectivity to the next level in a way that I think his predecessor did. And it's very clear, obviously, that, of all these players that Woodson has touched, all of the relationships that he has. And yes, if you do bring in someone like a Larry Brown, it certainly, in some sense, it feels very unconventional, and in some sense, kind of like weird or odd. You're like, okay, so Indiana might have Mike Woodson and Larry Brown on their staff now, and I think that's kind of a different way of going about it. But look, I think Scott Dolson looked at this and where it seems like things are going. It's a different way to set up a staff. It's a different way to set up the program as a whole. And maybe some of just from my eyes and my perception, like the oddness of it, or the like, what, Larry Brown, is just because it's not something that traditionally has been done. But if you think about why they're doing it, I think it can make a lot of sense.
This is kind of a loaded question, but what are your biggest concerns about this hire in terms of it not working out? Is it just the fact that, kind of going against everything we've talked about, is it just the fact that Woodson doesn't have the experience at the college level? Do you have a concern that he's not going to be able to get players? I think I've learned my lesson from the Archie hire, and that I was really high on it, and I thought it was going to work out, and I expressed that much. So I've been a little bit more hesitant to declare this one way or the other, because we have no idea what's going to happen. But I'm just trying to think of this from a perspective of what concerns me the most from this hire. And I think the things that stick out are the recruiting aspect, and just being able to navigate the portal and player movement right now, I think is a big challenge. It was going to be a big challenge if Archie Miller stayed, and he has experience at the college level. I think with this portal kind of becoming what it is, it almost feels like it used to be, the season ended at this point, Ryan, and we were just worried about kind of NBA decisions, and now it's this whole other beast to try to figure out who's coming and going from all these programs. And you said earlier that it's not really a comparison to free agency and NBA. It's not in that you don't sign guys and give them contracts, but it is almost like open season on rosters, and you really have to know kind of what guys are thinking within your program and avoid a mass exodus of players. And you also have to be able to figure out, you have to go in there. I think there's over 1,000 names now. You have to identify some guys you think you can get and make sure they fit. And to me, that is the most, or is the biggest outstanding question for me of how this is going to work, because that I think for guys who have been doing it a long time is a big challenge. And for somebody that's brand new, I think it could be a lot to tackle.
Yeah, look, I think talking about the portal, it's almost interesting because in some sense, I mean, I know it is different, but it almost does feel a little bit like free agency, where there might be more correlation than we might otherwise give it credit for. But I think in terms of the concerns, I think optics wise, when you look at sort of the history of the former player coming back and coaching, it hasn't always worked. That doesn't mean that it won't here. I mean, people have, it's not an apples to apples comparison, but there's, look, it's worked with Juwan Howard so far. There's these differences have been talked about with that enough that I don't know if we need to kind of rehash that. But so it's almost this, not that it was this big splash, at the end of the day, home run hire, I guess we could say. But if you look into it a little bit more, obviously, I think in terms of former players, you'd be hard pressed to find anybody with sort of more coaching credentials or experience at the highest level than a Mike Woodson. But it's one of these things where if they do hire a few more name type assistants and, really well-known, really respected, really long-term basketball minds, and they sort of have this, I don't know, for lack of a better term, all-star cast of coaches and such, and this way of going about things in terms of setting it up with more of this like NBA mind hive, more or less, and it doesn't end up working, I think it just doesn't look good. And I guess that would be where some of my concerns are at. And then just this, trying to bring the family back together, as he said, and this really IU tradition that, Mike Woodson seems to be very, very locked in on. He was instrumental in bringing Bob Knight back. And so it's like, if it doesn't work and Mike Woodson has to be let go because it doesn't work, I think that becomes a more difficult thing to do. I think it looks a little bit harder PR-wise than letting go of an Archie Miller or Tom Crean. So the concerns are almost around like this build-up for like, look at the staff, look at that Mata in here, and then it just, for whatever reason, doesn't work out. I think it's a harder thing or a tougher thing to sort of pull the plug on at the end of the road if it doesn't go well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The whole bringing the family back together thing is interesting because I thought in many ways that Crean did a decent job of that as best he could. Maybe he didn't focus on it as much as people would have liked, but there was a lot of instances where former teams came back and talked to the team and were around. The funny thing to me with Miller was, I don't know if you remember this, but like right after he got hired, they had like that state of Indiana thing, like in the new locker room, and all the former players were coming back and signing it. And that was like on social media for like a couple of months, and then we never saw it again. It was almost like this manufactured thing to me where like, hey, we're involving the former players by getting them to come back and sign this thing in the locker room. Look, we understand the history. But then after that, like it was almost like there was no attention brought to it at all. And in many ways, the more you talk to people and the more you kind of look at it, Bob Knight coming back last February was more a product of guys like Mike Woodson, Randy Whitman, Quinn Buckner, those guys just kind of realizing, hey, it's time for this to happen because Bob Knight's getting older and this is his opportunity to do this before it's too late. And it wasn't really a product of anything that the program behind the scenes like Archie Miller or those guys were doing to bring them back. And so I do think there is value in having that connection to the past, but I do agree with you that in the instance that it doesn't work out, it kind of muddies the waters in terms of how you get away from this in the future, because you're going to have a large portion of former players that want this to succeed and are going to want to give it as much time as possible. So that to me is an interesting piece, but I don't think the approach of having trying to tie two eras together is necessarily a bad thing, kind of on the surface, because really everything that we talk about, like with IU basketball being this great program, being this prestigious program, being this thing that can be great, is based on what happened like in the 70s and 80s. It's nothing that's happened really since the mid 90s on. is what's made Indiana basketball great. So for those who are like saying, well, we got to stop living in the past and all that, like the past is really what made Indiana this great program, and to completely ignore it or dismiss it, I think isn't necessarily the best approach to take.
Yeah, it's important, and honestly, I think it's baked in as part of the job, right? And so I think Crean, embraced it and did at times did quite well with it. I think if we look at the entire Archie Miller tenure, it didn't seem like something that, like, Archie Miller just wanted to coach the team, and that's about it. And all the other things that make Indiana wasn't really anything he ever connected to. And so it's part of the job. It's important for, all the reasons you listed. Like, this program was built on the backs of the 70s and 80s and, the Bob Knight tenure. And so I think having someone like Mike Woodson now that doesn't, he not only understands it, he lived it, is going to be important for people. And I think even some of the small stuff yesterday, like, he has this Twitter account now that's, Coach Woodson IU, I think it is. And he's, basically talking to the fan base a little bit with it. Like, we're ready to get going. And they put out a video message yesterday of him giving well wishes to the women's team in their Elite Eight game. Like, these are just those small sort of like PR things that at the end of the day, if you don't win, you don't win. And that's really what you're going to be judged on. But it's some of that easier PR stuff and connection to other programs in the athletic department, and just kind of being part of the team and the family at Indiana. And that's something that I think Mike Woodson is going to embrace, and has embraced his whole, basically since he stepped on the campus. And that wasn't something that Archie Miller embraced at all, really. So we'll see how this all goes, but I do think it is an important aspect. And what were we tying this to as I went off on this rant here? We were talking about something specific with Woodson and bring this back. There's one other thing I wanted to mention with this, but it's early my time over here on Mountain Time Zone still. So, one thing I do want to bring up, actually, I'm curious what you think about this, and it does tie into all this, is the fact that Mike Woodson brought Bob Knight up first, the fact that the program released a statement from Bob Knight, the fact that in another radio interview that Mike Woodson did yesterday, he did say that he wasn't going to have time yesterday to see Bob Knight, but he was going to, I believe, see him today. He had left a message with his wife to see him today, I believe. And Bob Knight lives in Bloomington. Like, I see this as a scenario where he's going to be at games next year. I think he's going to be in the stands watching games next year. Do you think that will be the case?
I think it's a lot more likely than it's ever been before in the past 20 years. I could see it. It's clear. You mentioned, the statement that he put out through IU basketball, like you mentioned, the wording of it is like our program. It's it very much feels like this is kind of come full circle in terms of all those years where Knight said he would never come back to Indiana, and all the things that he had to say about the administration that were bad, and people told him for all those years those people are gone. They just want to welcome you back. Now the fact that a guy that he recruited from Indianapolis, that he developed for 4 years, went on to a very successful college, NBA career, coaching career, is now overseeing the program, that was instrumental in getting Knight to come back to Assembly Hall. I have to believe that if his health allows him to be around and to be at games, I definitely think there's a very good chance for that to happen. And I think it's something that should happen. Look at at Purdue. Like Gene Cady is around that program. He's visible. He's around in games and different things, and I don't see it in any way as a bad thing. I mean, I was one of those people that always kind of subscribed to the idea of, you don't have to hire an IU guy, but if it does, if you do, make it make sense. Like to me, Steve Alford never made sense. This hire makes more sense to me, a lot more sense than Steve Alford, because you've got a situation where you've got a guy that worked for a long time in the NBA and very much feels like a guy that values and can build relationships. And so there's going to be some people would say, if Mike Woodson hadn't gone to IU, he's not considered in any way for this job. That's probably true. But you also have to look at what Indiana's done with its previous hires and not working out. And it seems to me that they're trying something different. We'll see if it works long term. But, I can just tell you from there's been a lot said nationally about IU basketball the last couple of weeks, and where the program stands from a national perspective, and the interest in the job, and maybe it being a little bit underwhelming for them to hire Mike Woodson. But I can tell you, in terms of the interest from the fan base, Ryan, and you can speak to this as well. I mean, this is the most interest I think we've had in the program since we've been doing Inside the Hall. I mean, the response to the whole coaching search, the whole change, it's clear that Indiana made the right choice in moving on from Archie Miller. The fan base is invigorated again. We'll see if it works out. But one thing that can't be disputed right now is that Indiana fans still love this program. They want to support it. And at the end of the day, they want wins. And if Mike Woodson can bring wins, people are going to be excited. And I think the program has a chance to be successful.
Yeah, the interesting thing on how this ended up working out is there was so much chatter, obviously, early on in the search about the whole Brad Stevens thing. And so many were saying essentially, more national media, and even, Woj said this, and I actually went back to reread this tweet after they hired Woodson, because he was so definitive about no head coach in the NBA is ever going to come back down to the college ranks, and basically like not now, not ever, unless they're like kicked out pretty much. So he did qualify it with head coach, but a lot of the talk about why Indiana basketball fans, and I think why there was like that initial hope for Brad Stevens, was because of what Indiana basketball is, what it is in the state, what it means to everyone there. And if you grow up in that environment and you're part of it, there is that pull, right? And so, okay, yeah, it wasn't the head coach Brad Stevens who, grew up an IU fan but didn't play there, didn't coach there, but they got someone that has been a head coach in the NBA, that was a current assistant in the NBA, that decided to leave a job in essentially, it's not quite the middle of the season, a little bit past the middle of the season, but he left during the season, an NBA job, to come back and to coach college basketball in Indiana at Indiana University. And I think it only, even though it was a different human being that ended up taking this path back from the NBA to the head seat in Bloomington, I do think it does speak to and sort of confirm what a lot of people out there were thinking with this hire, that there is the right person that's going to want to step back and embrace all of this. And Mike Woodson seems to be sort of almost like candidate number one for this, and his love for everything that is, and coming down from the NBA ranks.
We'll continue to follow all of the relevant developments as it pertains to IU basketball. There's still a lot to get to. Do you want to hit the season?
I know we're looking to wrap up, but do you want to hit the transfer portal stuff at all? Or maybe Trace Jackson Davis or any of that? Do we want to discuss that a couple minutes here?
Sure. Do you have takes on what Trace should do, or which guys Indiana should be looking to get back out of the portal?
Well, I guess I'm just curious to see how this does play out. I think this has been said already, but the fact that there is this NBA tie with the new head coach, I think, and just sort of looking at where Jackson Davis is sort of landing on some of the the NBA boards in terms of getting drafted or not, I think it's more compelling for him to come back now and maybe work with a staff that has more of that NBA experience, because he very well might not get drafted at all. I don't know if he will, but it certainly seems like the chances might be a little bit stronger with this staff than the staff before. Do you agree with that, or?
Well, here's something I was just thinking about. You mentioned Larry Brown, right? So Trace Jackson Davis, his dad, Dale Davis, I know he has a stepdad as well, but Dale Davis, who's been around as well at some games this year, and I think has a relationship with Trace, he played for Larry Brown in the 90s with the Pacers. So I wonder what that relationship's like, and I wonder if that could, if there is a Larry Brown connection here, I wonder if that could have any sway in terms of Trace coming back and kind of realizing as he talks to these guys who have been in the league that he can come back and maybe improve his stock. I mean, I think the decision for him comes down to, do you want to go play likely in the G League and try to grind your way up, or do you want to come back to Indiana and be the man? And, if he comes back, look at the guys that were kind of ahead of him in the pecking order in terms of the best players in the league this year. I mean, most of them are going to be gone. Luka Garza's definitely gone. Io's going to be out of there at Illinois. We'll see what happens with Kofi. But Trace Jackson Davis comes back to Indiana. He's, a very likely All-American candidate, and he's very likely in the running for Big Ten Player of the Year next year. So that's got to be appealing to him. I just think it's going to come down to whether or not he thinks he can get drafted and make a team. The one thing with him is he's a little bit older, I think, than most kids who are sophomores in college. So, there may be some hesitancy because I think a lot of times guys, the older they get, they're viewed to be less attractive by the NBA. But, I mean, we'll see what happens. I mean, I think that would be, if he comes back, it'll be real interesting to me to see what kind of team Indiana can put together next season, because I think it could be pretty competitive from right off the bat. The other guys, I think the most important ones, most important one other than him to get to come back is Armaan Franklin. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I certainly in terms of talent and what pre-injury, Armaan Franklin, I think, was playing great basketball and can definitely be a really good piece on this team going forward if he stays. I think I'm almost most curious on what Christian Lander decides. I think, him moving up a year was difficult in some sense, as it would be for anybody, no matter the talent level of the player. I know Dustin Pirak interviewed his father a couple days back, maybe at the end of last week after he put his name in the transfer portal. And some of the comments about his, we really feel like his confidence got shot at a certain point. He didn't play in the last game of the season at all. And some of the things seem to be just kind of talking about the Archie Miller staff and sort of how he was used and going back to the confidence of this whole team. So I think just because he has the potential to be so dynamic and he's a really skilled kid, but things just didn't work out this year for the most part, even though he had some flashes. I'd just be interested to see what he ultimately decides and if he does come back, or even if he doesn't. I'm just kind of curious overall what type of a player he turns into with being kind of small and moving up a level. But I mean, geez, some of the things that he can do, I think can be really special. So it'll be interesting, I think, to see what happens there as well.
I'd say Mike Woodson knows what it's like to be a kid from Indianapolis that plays at IU and reaches, pretty good heights as a college player and gets to the NBA. So if that's what Armaan Franklin aspires, it seems like it wouldn't be a bad place to start to learn under Mike Woodson. But as I said, Ryan, we'll continue to follow all of these developments at Inside the Hall. And really, as we kind of move into this next period of time, the next couple of weeks is going to be interesting from the staff standpoint, what players are coming and going, if Indiana's going to get into the transfer portal and look for some guys and get this roster taking shape for next season. I'm sure recruiting will start to pick up too in the next coming weeks and months, but I think the first priority is to kind of get a sense of who's going to stick around, and then you kind of build the team for next year based on that. So as I said, we'll continue to cover everything in Inside the Hall. If you enjoy Podcast on the Brink, subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a rating or a review would be much appreciated. And thanks, Ryan, for the time today, as always. And we'll be back, everybody, next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.